The Appalachian Trail is a 2,000-mile ribbon of wonder stretching from Georgia's misty foothills to Maine's granite crown. It's more than a path. It's a hymn of the mountains, sung by the footsteps of dreamers and wanderers. Each mile tells a story. Each peak holds a poem. Today, we'll be talking about a particular part of that trail in Southern Virginia.
Today, we're very excited to have as our guest Dr. Mills Kelly, a retired professor of history and a senior scholar at George Mason University's award-winning Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media. He's also the host of the podcast The Green Tunnel and author of Virginia's Lost Appalachian Trail. Thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thanks, Lynn. It's great to be here.
So I absolutely loved your book. I live in Charlottesville, and I love to go to, Shenandoah Valley and all of the AT Trail and all of, all the other trails. So your book was very interesting personally for me. And I'm just wondering, what was it that got you interested in writing this book? And if you had sort of a specific purpose behind it, or if you just wanted to write a really interesting sort of history of something you enjoy.
So actually, I did not intend to write this book. I was working on a book, which I'm actually wrapping up this week, called A Hiker's History of the Appalachian Trail.
Ooh.
And, but I don't know, 2019, 2020, something like that. I was in the archives and I ran across a document that completely derailed my my plan. And historians know that archives are really dangerous places because you open up a box and then you open up a folder and there's something in there you didn't expect, and then it's like Alice with the rabbit hole. You have to decide, like, am I going to jump into that rabbit hole or not? And in this case I did, and so I got completely diverted from what I was doing and ended up writing this first book instead.
You are not the first guest of ours to accidentally write a book.
Right.
Exactly,
I keep saying has never happened to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, when am I going to accidentally write a book?
Yeah. Well, and honestly, I would have just like peered into the rabbit hole and then kept moving. But this document from the late 1920s referred to the route of the Appalachian Trail along the boundary between Floyd and Franklin counties in southwestern Virginia, and which it does not do today, and it doesn't get anywhere near there. And so that first was a surprise. But then I think I still would have kind of skipped over it except that I'm originally from Franklin County. And we moved to Northern Virginia when I was a kid, but still I'm originally from there. And so like that little connection is what made me stop, slow down, read the document more carefully, and then think, there's something here that I need to know more about.
So for our listeners who may be unfamiliar, they may have heard of the Appalachian Trail, but what is it?
Yeah, great way to start. So the Appalachian Trail is the United States and maybe the world's first multi-state long-distance hiking trail. The first long-distance hiking trail in the U.S. was the Long Trail in Vermont, which when it was done was like 279 miles long. But the Appalachian Trail spans 14 states and from Georgia to Maine. And this year, I think it's 2,197 miles long. So it's a very long trail. And it was proposed in 1921 and begun almost immediately. But the real sort of serious work began 100 years ago in 1925. And so we're in the centennial year for the trail.
Okay.
And it became a national park in 1968. But before that, it was entirely a volunteer project.
Now, before we get into the details of the specific history that you cover, I'm curious about, because I'm based in LA, and hiking for us out here means one thing specifically, and for most people, it's going up Runyon Canyon in yoga clothes for about 20 minutes during your lunch break. We're gonna go for a quick hike, but given at the time in the 1920s, because it's a leisure activity, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
something that people do for fun. What was like hiking? What did it mean then? And what was sort of the context around that activity at the time?
So yeah, so as you know, that's a really great question because we tend to think of the Appalachian Trail as a trail that people hike the whole thing. They do that whole
Right.
Mm-hmm.
2,000 miles, and that's just not what it is. It was never intended to be that trail, and it's not really that trail.
Hmm.
There are last year fewer than 2,000 people. I think it was more like 1,200 people completed a through hike, meaning they started at one end and hiked all the way to the other, or they started somewhere in the middle and hiked to one end, came back to their starting point and hiked to the other end. But they did the whole thing in one season.
Mm-hmm.
The Park Service says that somewhere between 3 and 4 million people get on the trail every year. Many
Wow.
of them in their yoga clothes, just like you, and because it was always intended to be a place for people from the big cities of the East Coast where they would go for some fresh air, some sunshine, some time under the trees, maybe see some wildlife, and just kind of get away for a few
Okay.
hours, maybe a couple of days. But it was never intended to be this super long distance, this trail that people would hike over a super long distance.
Sure.
And the first person didn't accomplish that in one season until 1948. So,
Okay.
Wow.
and then it took another 2 decades for more than 100 people to have accomplished that.
So
That makes sense to me.
yeah, and I mean, along those lines, you were talking about the proposal of this trail, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. What was it, Benton MacKaye? So
It's
he
MacKaye.
proposes
It's
MacKaye.
the Scottish
Um,
pronunciation.
oh, so Benton MacKaye, he comes up with this idea of a multi-state trail, but he was thinking about more than just oh, people are going to get away. It seemed like he had something deeper about like kind of reminds me of the Jeffersonian view of what America should be. And he was thinking of like social transformation and things like that you talk about in your book. So what was he really thinking about when he came up with this idea as far as like what it would do for society?
Yeah, so it's important to know that MacKaye was a regional planner. He had a master's in forestry from Harvard. Who knew that Harvard had a forestry program? And I
Wow.
don't know if they still do, but they did then. And so, but he was a regional planner. He'd worked for various federal agencies on big regional projects, and he was also a socialist, but as I say in the book, he was kind of a Harvard socialist, meaning he didn't spend a lot of time with the workers. Just the workers
Sure.
were more of a kind of a theoretical construct for him. But he'd gone through these cycles of wealth and poverty in his life. His father was a real impresario, and sometimes they were wealthy, and sometimes they were begging for food from their relatives,
Right.
and so he'd had this like really kind of bizarre upbringing, and he had this, in 1921, we had just come out of the First World War. We had just come out of the influenza pandemic, which for the United States was much worse than the war in terms of death. And so he was very, and the society was industrializing rapidly. The cities were gross, polluted and crowded and loud, and he was from a small town in Western Massachusetts, Shirley Center, and he wanted people to have the opportunity to do what he called solve the problem of living, meaning living
Okay.
in a modern industrial society, and kind of get over the after effects of the war and the pandemic, and just find a way to find solace in their life. And that he believed that the mountains were the place that you would do that, because as a young person, that's what he had done.
Right.
And and it turns out he was right. Cognitive psychologists now will tell you that spending time under the trees is incredibly healthy psychologically, not just
Mhm.
physically. And so he just sort of intuitively grasped that notion, and so that was really the biggest thing. And then he had this notion of rural development around what he called shelter camps, that people from the cities would go and build camps where they could eventually have like cooperative agriculture. This was his socialism was starting to come out here,
Sure.
and and that they would help to. he wasn't really interested in the economic development of rural areas, but he was concerned that rural areas were depopulating, and
Okay.
and so it's kind of along those lines, and so he did have a much bigger purpose.
Huh.
Right.
How did he go about? So he's working for a bunch of these federal agencies, and having an idea is one thing, but getting it
Yeah.
done is another thing entirely.
Yeah.
Was there precedent for kind of these like interstate projects at the time,
Yeah.
or is this
Yeah,
sort of
not
a
really, not really. He was very aware of what was happening in Vermont with the Long Trail, and it
Mhm.
was an entirely volunteer project. Although eventually a volunteer project that took advantage of Forest Service, Vermont Forest Service labor, because it just turned out to be a little too hard for the volunteers, so they enlisted professional
sure?
foresters. But so he was, he was really aware of that, and he was a big believer in the untapped potential of volunteerism, and so he also saw this as a great chance to take advantage of volunteer labor, which turns out he was right. People volunteered, and so because the trail was really put together entirely by volunteers, and then even today is maintained entirely by volunteers.
Wow, that
Wow.
I am
really?
one of them. So, and
That's
I take care of
awesome.
one of the old trail shelters. But so he had this he had that kind of belief, and then something really bad happened in his life. His wife Betty, who was actually a much more prominent person than he was, she was a suffragette and a prominent anti-war activist, and
Oh,
she also had some serious psychiatric problems, and
Mm.
in 1921 she committed suicide,
Oh
and
gosh.
he felt really guilty about that. He was really kind of crushed by her death,
Mhm.
and so a friend of his was the editor of the American Journal of Landscape Architecture, and so invited him to come to this guy's estate in the New Jersey mountains, to spend a little time recuperating. And while he was there, he wrote up this proposal that was published in the Journal of the American Institute of it was American Institute of Architects, not Landscape Architecture, and so this guy published it for him. I think largely just as a friend to try to kind
yeah.
of help him get over his wife's death,
Mhm.
and but then that article landed at exactly the right moment, because all up and down the East Coast, hiking clubs had been forming,
Hmm.
as it was sort of a way for people to socialize, and
Mhm.
in a healthy way, and physical activity was becoming really popular for both men and women,
Mhm.
and so there's a lot of emphasis being put on exercise and healthy living, and so these clubs had already begun to form, and then they read this article and they were like, yeah, that's an amazing idea, let's do it. And so in 1925, his last great contribution to the whole thing was that he brought together a whole bunch of leaders in the sort of park and conservation and hiking world in Washington, D.C. They had a meeting, they formed what they called the Appalachian Trail Conference.
Mhm.
Hmm.
And that conference, which today is the Conservancy, they changed their name a couple decades ago when they became a land trust, but they then set about coordinating the building of this trail, which was completed 12 years later.
12 years, that's honestly with what it is, that doesn't seem like a lot of time when you're
No,
talking about a
No.
2,000-mile trail.
right. And
It's
some of
pretty
it,
quick.
they took advantage of existing trails. So like
Mhm.
around 100 miles of the trail was on the Long Trail in Vermont, so that was already
Mhm.
there. They took
Right.
advantage of the trail system of the Appalachian Mountain Club in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. The
Mhm.
Dartmouth Outing Club had a trail network also. So they took advantage of some of that, but like
Mhm.
south of the Potomac River, they had to start from scratch.
Yeah, it's still impressive. I think the raised bed I'm trying to build in my back in my backyard is going on 3 years,
Yeah,
and I think
right,
clearly outpaced
It's
right.
not
me.
gonna make it out of the state. Yeah.
But
No.
it's also important to note that when they declared the trail complete, probably half of it was on roads, and either
Okay.
Oh.
either like old forest roads that were
Mhm.
either not used anymore or only partially used, or paved roads,
Hmm.
and the trail didn't really get fully off road until the late 1980s, early 1990s. I mean, it's still not completely off road. Some of it goes through towns and stuff like that. But I would say today it's probably 98% trail.
Right.
I can picture that. A lot of the hikes near me have fire road,
Yeah,
or they
same
weave in
same
off of
thing.
them. Yeah,
Yeah, same
Yeah.
kind
yeah,
of thing.
Yeah. So your book is actually specifically about 300 miles
Hmm.
of the trail that was originally part of the trail in Southwest Virginia, went through where you were from, where you were born, and then was only there for a couple decades, and
Right.
then is no longer part of the trail. So, first of all, could you talk about how that trail was laid out? Because it sounds like there wasn't anybody in that area. There weren't any trail clubs. There weren't any trails already there. And when I think about making trails, everything I think of is modern technology. Like, how in the world did they do this without
Yeah.
drones? You know what I mean? And
Right.
all of these things that we have.
So when when they're trying to work out the route of the trail, one of the areas that was really a stumper for them was Southwestern Virginia, and for a couple of reasons. One of those was that it was not well mapped.
Hmm.
The the in some ways the best map of that part of the state had been done by a Confederate engineer during the Civil War in 1865,
Wow.
and so the Geological Survey just had not gotten good maps of that part of the state yet,
Hmm.
and so it was not well mapped, and so that was a problem. And then secondly, it's very unpopulated.
Hmm.
The largest city or town of any size in the stretch in that section of Virginia where my book talks about was Galax, which was a furniture and mirror manufacturing town. It had a population of about 2,000.
Oh, that's it.
The town of Floyd was like 500. Hillsville was maybe 400, and that was kind of it in terms of towns of any size. And so there wasn't a population base to draw on like Washington D.C. or Atlanta or
Right.
Philadelphia or New York. And so in terms of building a trail club, that was really challenging,
Yeah.
just because there weren't people. And so they had like figured out how to get the trail from just north of Atlanta to Damascus, Virginia, right on the
Hmm.
Tennessee Virginia line, and they'd figured out how to get the trail down from the Potomac River as far as what's called the Peaks of Otter,
Hmm.
outside of Lynchburg, Virginia. And then there was this gap that they didn't know where to go. And Myron Avery, who was the chairman of the Appalachian Trail Conference at the time, referred to it as terra incognita. And it was that was actually in the document that I saw that sort of
Oh,
pulled me
wow.
down into the rabbit hole. But and they were kind of stumped. And then like Myron Avery was a total control freak. And I mean, to say that he was controlling makes him sound relaxed and easygoing. And he was he was so controlling. And he gets this letter in the mail from somebody in the town of Floyd, um, and this little tiny town, and the county agent, and this guy says, "Hey, we've solved the problem of getting from the Peaks of Otter to Damascus. A friend of mine and I have, and so here's our proposal." Well, Avery had this freak out because that was not his idea. That was somebody else's idea. And
Oh.
the trail should be his idea. so,
Of
so
course.
right, exactly. So he wrote to one of his trail scouts, a guy who worked for the Georgia Forest Service. And he actually said in the letter, he said, like, I need you to come up here and scout out a route for the trail because we can't let those people, meaning the people in Floyd County, decide where our trail should go.
Wow.
And so this guy Roy Osmer comes up from Georgia to scout out the trail, and immediately just gets lost. He's just like he was
Yeah.
following a very old road,
Hmm.
which at the time was called the Ridge Road. Today it's called the Blue Ridge Parkway because the Blue Ridge
Okay.
Parkway, when they put the Blue Ridge
Oh.
Parkway in, they took advantage of this old road. But the Ridge Road is really one of the ancient routes in the mid-Atlantic of the U.S. It was laid down by the Cherokee originally just as a part of their warrior path,
Hmm.
and because it runs right along the escarpment of the Great Plateau of Southwest Virginia, and then it sort of drops off from the plateau down to the Piedmont, and so their path went along the edge there, and then colonial settlers, when they pushed the Cherokee out, took advantage of that path to then put in a road, which became known as the Philadelphia Road or the Carolina Road. It sort of depended on which direction you were going. And so because it was an old wagon road that took goods from the manufacturing centers of the mid-Atlantic down into the rural areas of the South, or farm goods like, hogsheads of tobacco or whatever, up into the markets of the mid-Atlantic. And so, but that road had fallen out of use because railroads had superseded it. And so it was just kind of there. And so Osmer's trying to use that, and he just keeps getting lost. And so he finally calls Shirley Cole, who was the county agent in Floyd, who had written that letter. And he's like, "Hey, can you show me where to go?" and Shirley Cole says, "Yeah, sure, that'd be great." And he had a car and he knew his way around. He was from there. And so he helps Osmer scout out the route. And then it's kind of hilarious because Osmer sends Myron Avery this 11-page single-spaced memo saying, "Okay, here's the route." And he basically just describes the route that Shirley Cole had described the previous year, but in a lot more detail. And in the very last sentence, he says, "And Mr. Shirley Cole of Floyd, Virginia, was very helpful to me in this process."
Oh, he's like, "That's what I was trying to avoid."
Right. So anyway, that's how they scouted it out. And that part of the state is incredibly beautiful because it's all high mountain plateau.
Yeah.
But because it's a plateau, you don't have the sense that you're up in the mountains. But but it's like the town of Floyd is at, I think, 2,700 feet above sea level. And so, which is like the elevation of a lot of the Skyline Drive in Shenandoah National Park.
Yep.
But it looks like the Piedmont because it's basically flat because it's a plateau. So, but walking along the edge of that plateau, the views are amazing. And, there's some and then you get to the New River. And once you get across the New River, then you're in the highest mountains in Virginia, the Iron Mountain Range, that goes up to over 5,000 feet, which, it's not a big deal for West Coast hikers because they're like 5,000 feet is just foothills in in the Sierras or the Rockies. But in Virginia, the highest peak is Mount Rogers, and it's a little over 5,000 feet.
Yeah.
So just to put a button on Avery, I mean, I'm sure we might talk about him some more, but what you described was like a very frustrating managerial style. I'm speaking from experience. But was he good at his job? Obviously, the rest of the trail got done. Like, was he competent?
So, Myron Avery had the energy level of two humans, and he was actually a government lawyer. He worked for the Navy, and he was an attorney for the Navy, and he also a Harvard grad. He'd gone to Harvard Law School, and he was a young man, and I guess he was probably in his 30s when he got involved with the Appalachian Trail, and but he really did have this just sort of commanding personality, and he was really driven, and there's a double entendre there because he did not have a driver's license, and so people had to drive him around, including his kids, who were very resentful of that, by the way, and so like they wanted to go to like a football game or something and not drive their father to the trail on the weekends, but they so he was incredibly driven and spent every weekend basically out scouting the trail, working with the trail clubs, helping build trail himself. And he worked himself to death. Literally, he died at age 51 or 52.
Oh my gosh!
Had a massive. He'd had a couple of small heart attacks, and then had a massive heart attack in 1952, I guess, in early 1950s. And we have in the archives we have an oral history with his youngest son, who said like the Avery family all had heart problems. All the men had heart problems, and so it's just a congenital thing, I guess. And,
sure.
But when he died, the leader of one of the other trail clubs quipped that Avery left behind two trails, the Appalachian Trail and a trail of bruised egos. So really, it probably would have gotten finished eventually because people really wanted to get it finished, but it would not have gotten finished in 1937 without him. It might have been after the Second World War before it was done because he was bound and determined.
Yeah, it's one thing to have a guy who really has a particular vision and needs you to follow the vision who's in
Yeah.
charge, if he's good. If they're also
Right.
incompetent and also want things done their way, then it's a whole different story.
Yeah.
No, he was very competent. He was just, people didn't like him unless he was like his people who worked for him loved him, because if you even looked sideways at one of his team, he would jump on you with both feet.
Okay.
So, he was very protective of his people,
That's good.
and his close friends liked him a lot, and everybody else thought he was kind of a jerk.
So you had mentioned about the National Park Service. It didn't become National Park Service till '68. So who owned this land that they're putting a trail through? Is it like private landowners who have to say, okay, you can put this trail through my land, or how did that work?
Yeah, so to the degree that they could, they ran the trail through public lands. And
Okay.
so when it was declared complete in 1937 from Georgia to Maine, probably 800 of the then 2,000 miles was on public land. And the
Okay.
rest of it was on private land. And that land was either owned by individuals or corporations, a lot of timber companies in the Northeast in particular.
Mhm.
And so they they had to negotiate easements with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of landowners, and for which they generally paid $1 per year. And because this was a volunteer project, they just didn't have
Right.
money, and landowners were by and large very happy to have the trail go across their land, because
Mhm.
it's a really kind of unpopulated part of America at the time.
Right.
And so and very few people hiked on the trail, so it wasn't like you had hordes of people hiking across your property.
Right.
Right. Like it is today.
Right.
Yeah. Still surprising though. Just the tendency to give access to your property is I can see people not wanting to do that.
That's really, at least on the East Coast, that turns out to be a like 1960s and later attitude.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Prior to the 1960s, I don't see a lot of evidence in the archives that people were resistant at all. They were like, "Oh yeah, sure, yeah, you can route a trail across my farm, no problem.
This
Just
is entirely
make sure
an
it's not too close to the house or that kind of thing."
Right.
Yeah, I
This
feel
is
like now
entirely an
everywhere.
anecdote. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, you tell your anecdote, but I was just gonna say now I feel like every time I'm on the Blue Ridge Parkway or I'm anywhere near that, everywhere I look is posted no trespassing, and then you have to like search for a place you're allowed to go.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
it feels like it was very different back then.
It was very
Yeah.
different.
Yeah, there's the brief anecdote. I'm thinking back to just the sense of like, this is my space, and I, don't want people coming like walking on it. My father's family moved out to the suburbs in the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s. I don't know exactly when. But in the early pictures, there were no fences in that entire development.
Mhm.
Like everyone's backyard was just all open across the thing. And I don't know when the fence was built, but it was definitely after that. I don't know why I felt that there was a parallel there. May or may not have been. Might have been money.
Well, no, I think that's
No,
probably
it
right.
is.
And but like I say, there's just very little evidence in the archives that people resisted. But then when the National Scenic Trails Act passes in 1968, and it's clear that the Park Service is going to start acquiring this land, some people do take it the wrong way, and or take it, askance, or they look askance at it, and they resist. But not many. In the context of the whole project,
Right.
there were certainly plenty of people who did, but by and large, most people were willing to abdicate their land for the trail.
Oh, that's
So-
actually pretty cool.
Yeah, one of the things I love about your book is that it made me feel nostalgic for a place I'd never been. Like it made me want to go and visit it, but it also made me sad for what it used to be. And you talk about how one of the aspects of the trail was these shelters or places where hikers could go, or you even mentioned abandoned buildings that people would go and stay in, which I just thought was really cool. I'd love to do that. But there weren't shelters. There weren't really a lot of shelters in Southwestern Virginia, and how hikers sort of ingratiated themselves in with the towns. Like I felt nostalgic for it, even though I've never experienced it.
Well, and it hasn't, it's really interesting because that went away I mean, hikers used to stay in people's homes as boarders,
Yeah.
and that was really common. And then in the 60s and 70s, that kind of declined as a thing. And and it's also important to remember that most people were just hikers. They weren't backpackers. They weren't staying overnight, and
Right.
so they'd stay in hotels and that kind of thing. And but those who were staying, out on the trail for 3 or 4 nights a week, a couple of weeks, whatever, they would go and stay in people's homes and get a meal and a hot shower for $1.50 or whatever, and very small amount of money, and they would meet people, and the people would meet them, and so there's this cultural exchange that happens also that was really, really great. But that kind of went away in the 60s and 70s, and then sometime in the 90s it starts coming back, but in a different way. As the volume of hikers along the trail begins to increase, people see an economic opportunity and start opening hiker hostels, usually as an outbuilding on their property or something like that. Today, there are some that are sort of purpose-built structures. But, I live half time on a mountain near Front Royal, about a mile from the trail. And one of my neighbors they repurposed their garage as a hiker hostel.
Oh.
And they have, dozens of hikers every year who stay with them. And they like it. They like meeting the hikers and sharing a meal with them and that kind of thing. And then we also have now Airbnb and VRBO, and which is a version of this, of taking in boarders,
Right.
That's true.
Yeah. Just
That's
slightly
full
more
circle.
commodification
Right.
than it feels like.
It was just much more informal in the old. I mean, it used to, like in Southwestern Virginia, in the hiking guide that described the area, there were the phone numbers of people who would take in boarders, and so you just got to a place where you could make a call, and you called, Erna Webb, and said, I'm hiking on the trail. Can I stay with you tomorrow night? And she would say yes, and you then got to the point of the trail near her house, and you diverted and went and spent the night.
Huh. So, were the towns, besides taking in these hikers and towns along this effect, like, changed in any way? Besides that, you were talking about the cultural exchange. What did you have any, what were the effects of that?
So in the stretch of the trail that I wrote about in the book, not really, because the trail moved away. We can talk about this later, but the trail moved away right after the Second World War. But and so the volume of hikers that people would have met was very low. The trail wasn't that popular yet, and it was a more inaccessible part of the state. In Shenandoah National Park, there were already a lot of hikers out day hiking on the trail. But places like Front Royal at the north end of the park really benefited from not only the park, but especially the park, but also hikers. And like if you drive through the northwest end of Front Royal today, you'll see, I don't know, 6, 8 old motels that now are probably mostly day laborers living there. But then we're for the people visiting the park. And but in Southwestern Virginia, not really, just because it was so removed. It just really didn't make that much of a difference. But
do you think it?
But today there are a lot of what we would call trail towns that are really dependent on hikers for business. Hot Springs, North Carolina is a good example, although it's barely there because of Hurricane Helene. But the trail goes right through Hot Springs, and there's the local diner, the Smoky Mountain Diner, which has Appalachian Trail murals all over the walls and stuff like that. And the woman who owns it is a hiker, and I'm gonna go. I haven't checked in with her to see how she's doing, but because she was on our podcast, and she probably had 10, 15 feet of water during the storm.
Goodness gracious.
But I mean, Hot Springs was almost wiped off the map, and but there was a brewery there and a couple of other restaurants that wouldn't be there. So pre-Helene were there, and they wouldn't be there, or would not have been there were it not for the trail.
Gotcha.
Right, and that's actually what I was going to ask. I know we hate what ifs as historians, but if the trail had stayed where it was initially, do you think it could have impacted and changed what, like Floyd and those towns are today?
So yes, and I think the best example of that is the town of Fries, which is spelled like fries, like French fries, but pronounced
Hmm.
Fries. Fries was a mill town. There was a big linen mill there, or cloth mill there, and which closed in the 1980s and really gutted this town because it was a mill town. I mean, like the mayor, when I interviewed him, he said when he went off to basic training during Vietnam, he was a little confused about money because in Freeze you just signed for everything because the mill
Oh,
owned everything except the post office.
right.
And
Okay.
the doctor and the dentist worked for the mill, and the bank
Mm-hmm.
belonged to the mill, and the stores belonged to the mill, and so you just signed your parents' name. And so he went off for basic training and was a little confused about making change, for instance. And
Right.
his buddies, he said his buddies were like, "What planet are you
Yeah.
from? You don't know the
Like a
difference between a nickel and a quarter,
Oh, wow.
And so but so Freeze was really gutted by the loss of this mill in the 1980s. But if the Appalachian Trail, it crossed it's right on the New River, and
Mm-hmm.
it crossed the river just about a mile and a half north of town. And if the trail were there, thousands and thousands of hikers would be stopping in Freeze for an ice cream, a pizza, spend the night, you
Right.
know,
right.
going to the pharmacy, whatever. And so it would have been a real tremendous economic boom for this little town, which,
Right.
it's in an incredibly beautiful location, but there's like
Mm-hmm.
nothing there economically.
Right. Right. So, do you think for people who, so I've been on the trail sort of more towards Central Virginia, Northern Virginia, but for people like Isaac who have never been on it, or listeners who are from the Midwest and have never been on it, could you just give us a little bit of a visual picture of this trail, especially like the in the Southwest Virginia, what they might see, what the vistas would look like, just so people can get an idea or
Yeah,
sense of what it
yeah.
is?
So it's sort of two. There's sort of two trails. The first is the pre-World War II version, and the second is the post-World War II.
Mm-hmm.
The pre-World War II version was largely through farmland, open spaces. So even Shenandoah National Park was, which you've been to, and you get up on
Mm-hmm.
top of the mountain, and there are all these forests and everything. Those are
Right.
all post creation of the park. That was all open farmland up on top of the
Oh,
mountain,
Oh.
and so the park was kind of renaturized when it became a park.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you hiked in the Appalachian Mountains in the 1930s and 1940s, you were still largely hiking through, in large tracts of it were still open, or
Mm.
had recently been logged off, or so so it was pretty open, and so the vistas were different than they are
Mm-hmm.
today. Today, you see a lot more trees than you would have seen in the 1930s, 1940s, um,
hmm.
and you pass through a lot fewer farms and like
Yes.
farm fields where you have to dodge the cows or whatever, and so and the trail was not before the 1960s, the trail was not a really well-worn footpath except in the most popular places like Shenandoah National Park, the
Mm-hmm.
Smokies, the Green Mountains, the White Mountains. And so it was sometimes a little hard to find,
Hmm.
and I mean it's blazed every you know it's supposed to be blazed every quarter mile at a minimum. Now it's blazed more like every 100 yards.
Mm-hmm.
But so, it could be a little tricky sometimes, but now it is just a very well trodden path. It's almost impossible to lose the trail.
Right.
I mean, there are a few places like in the 100-mile wilderness in Maine where it's definitely possible, but the it's just and it's in New England, it's much higher mountains, it's
Mm-hmm.
spruce forest. From south of Massachusetts, it's oak and poplar forests, and the mountains are lower and gentler, so it's not a tremendously difficult trail to hike on. I mean, it's still a mountain trail, so there is up and down, and it
Right.
can be strenuous, but it's not hiking, in the Sierras or something like
Right.
that. And so, although I had someone tell me not long ago that they thought they'd hiked both the Pacific Crest Trail in the west and the Appalachian Trail, and they thought the Appalachian Trail was a little harder because
Hmm.
the Pacific Crest Trail was built also to be traversed on horseback, and horses can't do steep grades. And so the
Whoa.
Appalachian Trail has more steep grades than the Pacific Crest Trail does. On the other hand, the highest point on the Appalachian Trail is just a little over 6,000 feet, as opposed to like 14,000 feet on
Oh my
the
gosh.
Pacific Crest. But it is, it's the Appalachian Mountains are, I would say, a gentle mountain landscape
Mhm.
and more sort of rolling rather than rugged.
Right, right.
Gotcha. Now, I definitely know what it means, but for those who are listening who don't know, what does blazing mean?
Oh,
Yeah, thank you. So blazing, so when you build a trail, people have to be able to follow the trail. And as I say, it's easier to follow now because it's so many people have walked on it, you can sort of see it
mhm.
on the ground. But in the old days, you couldn't. And or in the fog or whatever, still, it can be a little tricky. So blaze is a white rectangular mark painted on a tree or a rock or a fence post or whatever.
Okay.
So it's to help you find the trail.
I definitely knew that before you just explained it.
Okay.
And these
For the
days there
record.
will be several trails that cross sect, so you'll be following yellow and all of a sudden it turns red and you
Mhm.
don't know
Ah.
why. Or I don't know why.
Yeah, so the
So-
Appalachian Trail is the only one that's on the East Coast anyway. It's the only one that's blazed white.
Okay.
Oh, that's good to know.
Yeah.
So we've referenced it moving a bunch. Why is there an old
Yeah.
Appalachian Trail in Virginia and a new one, or the current one?
Yeah. So already by 1940, the Appalachian Trail Conference and the Roanoke Appalachian Trail Club, which had a lot of responsibility for the trail in that part of the state, had decided that it just really wasn't working in that part of the state because there weren't volunteers to help with the maintenance, and and so it was difficult to keep it open and hikeable, and so that was a problem. The Blue Ridge Parkway had come in and taken away some of the best stretches of the trail. They had to move the trail off to the side, um, and so that was also a problem. And then there was an opportunity, which was that during the Great Depression, farmers, especially in southwestern Virginia, had largely abandoned their farms and because of the depression conditions, and so the federal government, especially the U.S. Forest Service, was buying up huge tracts of land in the 1930s, and they created several national forests or expanded dramatically several national forests, and so the Unaka, now the Jefferson National Forest, grew dramatically in this period of time. And so all of a sudden, there was public land just on the other side of the New River from where the original Appalachian Trail was. And so they could move the trail 50, if they moved the trail 50 miles to the west, they would put it inside the National Forest. And they wouldn't have to worry about all these easements. They wouldn't have to worry about somebody canceling access. And they would have the Forest Service to kind of help keep an eye on it and help a little bit with trail maintenance. So it was both a problem and an opportunity that caused them to move the trail, which they ultimately did after the war. And in 1952, they declared the old section of the trail done, and they wrote it out of the trail guides. And the next year, 1953, new trail guides came out with the new route. And so it was like the old route just vanished.
Gotcha. So,
But you got to,
yeah.
oh, I'm sorry, Isaac.
No,
You
go ahead, Lynn.
In your book, you had people show you around the old route. So I'm curious what's there now and if people can go and sort of see some of it or, what's left.
So it's important to remember when I say the old trail vanished, it vanished to the hiking public. It did
Right.
not vanish to the people who lived there because it had been a part of their life for 2.5 decades.
Right.
And it was for them, it was a connection to like a bigger part of the world.
Mhm.
And so they were really proud of it, and they were very sad when it went away. And so in some cases quite angry actually, and so people still remember it. I mean, I interviewed a whole bunch of people who some of them in their 80s, and or the oldest was 101, and who remembered the trail quite well, and so still a part of their life in that way, in the way that our memories are part of who we are.
Yeah.
It went away in one sense, but it didn't go away in another sense. And you can hike sections of the trail, the old trail. One long section from the if you cross over the New River going west, west and south, you can get onto what's called the Iron Mountain Trail, and which is maintained by the state. And the Iron Mountain Trail is the old route of the Appalachian Trail. They just rebranded it, and so that is the old AT for about 130, 140 miles.
Oh, wow.
And it goes all the way down into Damascus. And so you can hike from Damascus to the New River on the Iron Mountain Trail, and it's a multi-purpose trail, like horseback riders, mountain bikers, hikers, and then on the east side of the New River, there are bits and pieces that you can access.
Mm-hmm.
And the most fun, since you live nearby, Lynn, the most fun is if you drive down the Blue Ridge Parkway from Roanoke and you're going south, you get to one of the turnouts called the Saddle.
The Saddle.
And
Okay.
if you get off at the Saddle and you go and look at the view out over the Piedmont, if it's not foggy, which it's foggy like every other day, but if it's not foggy, the view is beautiful. But when you're standing there, if you look to your right, you will see a little piece of trail heading up the into the forest. That's the old Appalachian Trail. And if you go up that for about a half a mile, maybe even just a quarter mile, there's an old trail shelter there, which was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps. And it's the only shelter that was ever built on this old stretch of the trail. And so it's a great place to go for a picnic, just saying.
Oh, I love that.
Very cool. We normally end our episodes trying to by asking our guests to recommend somewhere to visit.
The whole
That's where I would go.
Right, we're talking about. Yeah.
That's where I would go. So a great day trip for Lynn from Charlottesville is to go down, have a picnic at the old trail shelter, and then go into the town of Floyd for dinner at the Floyd Country Store, and which has been going forever. And if you go on a Friday or a Saturday, Friday is the Friday Night Jamboree, which is now 40 plus years old.
Oh, wow.
And Saturday night is like open jam night, and so the music is amazing.
Ah,
and the food is great.
I love it.
that sounds very cool.
Well, I have plans. Yeah. I'd say.
So, given your personal connection to like where you grew up and stuff like that, would you think the move was the right thing to do? That opportunity that they had in the province?
I have to say it was only because it put the trail into this federal landscape and gave it federal protection. And I mean, this is still a relatively low population part of the state, and so in terms of what was good for the trail, it was better to move it. In terms of what was good for the region, it was a really bad idea.
Sure. That makes sense.
So one of the things I really love about the podcast was where you have snippets of interviews, and you interviewed a lot of people. And so I'm interested in, well, first of all, you get things from oral interviews that you're not going to get from any other sources. Right. So, what sort of things did you get from some of these people? And do you have any good stories or anything about them that sort of stick in your mind?
Well, actually, I'm going to change just going to twist that around a little bit and say what I really got was friends. Because when I started working on the book, I realized at some point the archives weren't going to do it for me. And so I had to just go. Yeah. And so I got in my car and I drove down to starting in Floyd County, and I just started talking to people. And, one of my favorite moments was I went into this diner it's called the Lakeview Diner. There's no lake anywhere nearby, but it's the Lakeview Diner. And so I'm having breakfast at this diner in Fancy Gap, Virginia. And so I said to the waitress, I was sitting at the counter, and kind of classical Virginia diner. And I said, do you know the Appalachian Trail used to go right past your front door here? And she's like, how about that? I didn't know that. And I said, anybody around here know anything about it? And she's like, yeah, I think she said Charlie comes in here sometimes, talks about it. And I was like, oh, does Charlie have a last name? And she thought about it, and she said, no, just Charlie. So that was kind of a dry hole. I wasn't going to get anything out of that. But I did begin to meet people, and my favorite in many ways is this guy named Ralph Barnard. And Ralph's got to be 85 now, and he's just the sweetest guy. And his grandfather, who raised him, was responsible for the trail in the Dan River Gorge, which was described as the second most difficult part of the whole trail by hikers.
Mm.
And so as I'd been talking to people, they kept saying, "Oh, well, you need to talk to Ralph Barnard, but Ralph can be a little difficult or crusty, or things like that." And so I'd been putting off talking to Ralph because they'd sort of scared me. And so, but I finally, I had to talk to him, and I called him, and I started talking, and he hung up, and because he thought I was a telemarketer.
Okay.
Because why wouldn't he think that, right? Why wouldn't he think that? And so I called a couple times, and he just kept hanging up on me. So so I wrote him a letter, and then he called me right away and apologized, for hanging up, and invited me to come to his house, and we exchanged Christmas cards. I've been to his house half a dozen times, I bet, and so you can hear him on the podcast talking about his grandfather and about the trail, and he, and Ralph and his just lovely wife Hope have just been so sweet to me, and so like we're friends, and Doug Bell and his wife Arlene also friends, and Dylan Locke, who owns the Floyd Country Store, really close friend now, and so in some ways that's what I got out of this, was I got friends, and that's you don't make friends in the archives in that way.
That's true. With no one alive. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think. Well, I know some. It doesn't happen very often. Let's be careful. Not very often that historians are actively seeking out human contact.
That's true.
Most of the people that we interview are very into their archives and very interested in sort of the less extroverted version of this kind of study. But it's very cool that you got your boots on the ground and went to check it out.
Well, and I will say, I had an advantage because I was originally from Franklin County, and
sure.
I'm not, although I moved to Northern Virginia when I was 5. So really I'm from Northern Virginia.
Right.
But so I would start my, chat with people and say, I got interested in this because I'm originally from Franklin County. My father taught at Ferrum College, and they say, "Oh, you're from here." And I said, "Well, not really. I moved to Northern Virginia when I was 5." And they're like, but no, you're from here. Now you're a Kelly. Are your people up on Kelly's Knob? And I say, no, my father's from Tampa, Florida. My mother's from Atlanta. And so I'm the only one from Virginia. And they'd be like, "Oh, okay. But you're a Kelly. So now you have to know the Kellys from Floyd." And so, and I never said, yes, I am one of those, but I did, but it sort of gave me this entree,
right?
Sure.
Where if I was, like some historian coming from Northern Virginia with no connection to the region, I still think people would have opened up, but it just would have taken a little longer, because people in Southwestern Virginia are just incredibly friendly and nice and fun to talk to.
That's neat. That's a neat intersection of an area of interest of study for you and like a personal history connection. That's very, very cool.
Yeah.
It's always I think part of what Lynn is describing in your book, and this is true in the way you just talk about the trail in the podcast, is that it does make you feel nostalgic. I think it's partly your feelings about it, that you actually have a connection to the Appalachian Trail.
So and just to interrupt for a second, I say there's one other thing that I think is kind of from a methodological standpoint is important for me, and that is that I started off researching and writing on the book to tell the story of the trail, and what happened along the way was I ended up telling the story of the people.
Right.
Sure.
And so the trail became the way that I told the people's story, not the other way around. And I think that that's why it resonates with so many people. I mean, I gave a talk at the Floyd Historical Society in, I guess, November, and like 50 people showed up. And this is, you got to remember, this is a town of like 500 people.
Wow.
So, I gave a talk at Benton Mountain, Virginia, which is a town of, I don't know, 50, 100, something like that. And 35 or 40 people showed up.
Half the town.
Yeah. And it's because people have read the book, they realize that it's about them.
Right.
Right.
And so then they want to come and hear more.
Right.
I never would have thought of a hiking trail as being like a reflection of people. If you could take any takeaways from this, like as far as your perspective on those people and how the trail affected them, what is the some insight that you may have gained via this research?
So maybe you've noticed that we're in a kind of contentious political moment here in the United States. Maybe
Mhm.
You
maybe
don't
that's
say.
like come across your screen. And
Just a little.
so when one of the people, or two of the people who I became good friends with, were Paula and Sally Rakes. And Sally is in her, I think she just turned 80, and Paula's her daughter and in her 50s. And their family they were Dixons, and the Dixons came to the New River in a land grant from the Revolutionary War. And so the Dixons still own a tiny little piece of land right on the river. And they're part of the story of the trail because they used to run a ferry across the river, which is how hikers got back and forth.
Oh.
The New River is easily 100 yards wide there.
Mhm.
And so I got to be friends with Paul and Sally. And in 2019, summer, or maybe 21, with COVID, you lose track of,
Yeah.
was it
Yeah.
before COVID, after? I think it might have been after COVID. But so they invited me to their family reunion in July.
Oh.
And so I went,
Nice.
and it was really fun. And there was a big like Trump flag hanging from the little house that they have on their property, which is where the food gets put out and stuff.
Mhm.
And it's more like it's not a shack, makes it sound dilapidated because it's not, but just a really small structure.
Mhm.
And and it was fine. And and at some point, Sally's brother, Griggs, comes up to me and he says, and he's also not young, and he says, "So I understand you're writing a book about my family." And I said, "Well, sort of, your family's part of the story." And he said, "Oh, that's really nice." And he said, and I hear you're a college professor." And I said, "Yeah, that's right. I am."
Uh-oh.
And he said, "Well, you must be a liberal." And I said, "That's right, I am." And he said, he kind of chuckled, and he said, "We don't meet a lot of liberals around here. Maybe you and I could sit down and talk a bit." And I said, "I would love that, Griggs."
Oh.
And so we got hot dogs and Cokes, and we sat down at a picnic table, and we talked about everything except politics.
Oh.
He showed me a picture of this huge catfish that his grandson had caught the week before, and he wanted to know about my kids. And so here are two people on completely opposite ends of the political spectrum,
Mhm.
and we were just people. We just talked.
Yeah.
Right.
And I was driving home, and I was reflecting on that, and it reminded me that much of the political circus that we're part of at the moment takes place in these media bubbles in big
Mm.
cities, and
Yeah.
that the rest of the United States is part of that story, but they're not as invested in it.
Right.
And so it's a
Gotcha.
good reminder that just because we have these different political views doesn't mean we're not people.
Right.
We don't have things in common.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who knew a project conceived by an ivory tower socialist 100 years ago could
Right.
bring in
Right.
people
Harvard.
together?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Bringing people together 100 years later.
Yeah.
That's a great story. I actually think that's a wonderful place, a wonderful thought to leave our listeners on. And
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
get outside, breathe some fresh air, talk to someone you might not otherwise talk to.
Right. I
Absolutely.
completely agree.
That's
No
great.
matter where, and I'm sure no matter where you live, there are trails. It doesn't have to be
That's right.
AT. I'm sure they're everywhere.
Yeah.
Isaac.
Oh, there are plenty here.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, just and so I'll leave you with this. So I've been going to a conference in Alberta, Canada, and one of the great things that they do at the conference is they have poets who do pop-up poetry. And if
Oh.
you've ever been to a pop-up poetry event, it's amazing that they just bang out a poem for you in like 30 seconds, what a talent. And so I went for the last time, since I'm retiring, I went for the last time in November. And so I asked one of the poets who I've known now for a while, I said, I want a poem about backpacking in the mountains. And he said, he thought about it for a minute, and then he said, okay, I've got one for you. And he said, but if it's not what you wanted, if it's too short, I'll do another one. And what he said, the poem he banged out took about 5 seconds because it's just a very few words. And the poem, I have it memorized because it's so short. And it is, in the mountains, the mind becomes a heart.
Oh,
And I said, okay, you nailed it.
I love
Absolutely
that.
nailed it. And so that's actually going to be in the flyleaf of my book that's hopefully going to come out this fall. And because that's the advantage of going hiking, is that your mind can become a heart.
Well, that's great.
That's perfect. That's a
That's a-
perfect way to end and encourage people to go on a hike.
Yeah.
Go on a hike, folks. And if you enjoyed this conversation, as always, it was brought to you by our supporters over on Patreon. So if you want to get early access to our content and some behind the scenes stuff, or get access to our Discord, make sure you go and check out patreon.com/primary source media, and make sure you go listen to Dr. Kelly's podcast, The Green Tunnel, which is produced by R2 Studios, some good friends of our show. And check out both his book, The Virginia's Lost Appalachian Trail, and keep an eye out for the one that's upcoming.
Mm-hmm. And check out all the links in the show notes.
What was the title of the new book?
A Hiker's History of the Appalachian Trail.
A Hiker's History of the Appalachian Trail. Make sure you put on a Google alert so you know when it comes out.
Sometime this fall.
So, thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Kelly. This is great.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.